Oh, it gives me an option to leave the meeting. Shall I run away?
Please don't do that.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for the warm welcome. And thank you to the UCL Center for Applied Linguistics for inviting me to be here with you today. The title of my talk today is Toward a Model of Second Language Feedback Effectiveness Capturing the Whole Learner. And a colleague looked at this title and she said, I think we need to review your ethics application. This whole capturing business is not how we are supposed to go about it. So yes, as you will have probably guessed, we're not physically capturing our learners, but instead capturing the essence of the whole learner in the consideration of feedback effectiveness. All right, I'll go ahead and start with a spoiler so that you know where we're headed today. Statistically, corrective feedback is indeed better than no corrective feedback. And if you are new to the field of corrective feedback, if you haven't done a lot of reading in this area, your initial reaction might be, well, yeah, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Much research on corrective feedback effectiveness is based on a limited demographic, and we'll talk about that. Theory needs to limit its claim or develop to extend its reach. And CF research would benefit from greater consideration of learner background. All right, so today I'm going to just cover three studies that I've done in a series. The first one looks at two kinds of corrective feedback. The second looks at ways of facilitating learners' use of that feedback. And the third will look a bit at feedback literacy and learner engagement with corrective feedback. So this being academia, we need a definition, and the functional definition that I'm working with today is an indication to a learner that his or her use of the target language is incorrect. Okay, now we could go off track here and have an interesting discussion about how important it is, accuracy is to learners to begin with. We could talk about how much focus we should be putting on accuracy, but the fact is that standardized tests like IELTS and TOEFL demand accuracy from our learners. The learners' social environments can require that they develop accuracy, and so it is the responsibility of teachers to help those learners develop what they need to succeed in their contexts. So just briefly, for anyone who is relatively new to corrective feedback research, it's sort of kicked off in 1996 with Truscott's claim that we needed to stop giving corrective feedback, that it was actually, it wasn't just not useful, it was actually harmful to learners. And I think the field had just had this collective gasp of shock. And then after a moment of shock, there was this moment of, wait a minute, that means I could get back my evenings and my weekends and not have to spend all of this time marking. So the field looked at the research that Truscott was using to make this claim, because it wasn't an empirical study, it was a review that he used to make this claim about it being detrimental. And researchers said, well, yeah, actually the studies aren't very well designed. We can see that there are definitely some problems here. We can't say it's detrimental, but on the other hand, according to what we've got, we also can't say it's useful. And so hence kicked off a period of quite intensive corrective feedback research, which led Ferris in 2004 to look back over the previous 8 years and say, okay, now we have our improved research designs, we have better evidence, and that, yes, now we can say, great, corrective feedback is useful, or it can be, but now we need to figure out how, in what ways, to whom. That was 2004. And in more recent research, you can see researchers asking the same thing. Yes, it can be useful. What we're trying to do is figure out how. So let's just briefly take a look at two types of corrective feedback that are commonly looked at in studies. One is indirect and the other is direct. Now, indirect corrective feedback is where the teacher might, for example, make a tick mark on the paper or underline the problem. Alternatively, they could use a code to indicate to the learner the type of problem. The key is in indirect corrective feedback, the correction is not provided. The learner is supposed to work it out for themselves to engage with what they've been given. On the other hand, direct corrective feedback supplies that correction directly onto the paper. Well, since I'm talking about written corrective feedback today. So we might cross out words that are unnecessary, add in words that are needed, put the S on the end of that noun to make it plural. So let's start with this, these two types. Do we have, can we fit corrective feedback into theoretical models or theoretical frameworks that we're already using? Well, yes. Skill acquisition theory, for example, is a matter of practicing. So you practice, you try something and you get feedback on it, you try it again. And through this process of increasing your, of doing things again and again, then it becomes less effortful and more automatic. Information processing is another theoretical framework that makes room for corrective feedback. In that the increased cognitive effort there, the learner's increased effort to understand, to interpret, to make use of their feedback can then result in increased learning of the information. And then, of course, there's the interaction framework. So the learner produces an utterance or a piece of text that contains an error, is made aware of that error through some form of interaction. It could be oral or written feedback from the teacher, and learner then modifies that output. So we can see theoretically, we have that framework for support for corrective feedback. What exists empirically to support this pedagogy? So corrective feedback, and I'm going to use this term a couple of times today, this consistently inconsistent. So corrective feedback treatments, when they're compared in research, they are shown generally to be effective compared to no corrective feedback, compared to a control group. But the treatments, when we compare them to each other, tend to be, again, quite similar. And this has led Bichner and Noach to suggest that, well, maybe it doesn't matter what form of corrective feedback we provide, as long as we're giving them something. The learners will be able to take in whatever we offer them and use it to some extent. And there may be truth to that. Now, this is not what they were suggesting. They were not suggesting that corrective feedback is done and dusted and we don't need to study it anymore. This was just an idea from their findings, which again, consistently showed this inconsistency. It's worth considering why there is so much inconsistency in this research, though. And one way of looking at what might be happening is dividing it into learner internal variables and comparing those, or sorry, not comparing them, but also learner external variables on the other hand. So learner internal variables would include second language proficiency, self-efficacy, self-regulation, aptitude, experience, learner maturity. All of these have been investigated and have been shown to different degrees to potentially impact on learners' ability to use and benefit from corrective feedback. The learner external variables might include, for example, the philosophical approach of the researcher, how they designed their study. It could also be impacted on by the context in which that study is taking place. Now, because these learner external variables are considered less commonly in research, let's take a deeper look at those right now. So if we were to take the field of second language writing and sort of try to organize the studies into two groups, we might find that they would tend to fall into what we call the second language acquisition field of research and the L2 writing field of research. Now, there are some researchers who will get a bit grumpy with me for creating these, well, it wasn't my creation, but for using these two categories. And they say, well, you know, this research is not a monolithic thing. It doesn't necessarily fall neatly into one of these categories. Yes, I acknowledge that's true, but it still has value because of the tendencies of the research that we see. So to take a quick look there, a characteristic of the SLA approach to designing research would be something that was highly controlled, and we'll take a look at some examples of that. But just to contrast that with the L2 writing approach to investigating second language writing, it tends to be a bit more naturalistic. Well, what does that mean? Well, for example, when the tasks are selected for learners in order to gather data, in the SLA approach, we'll find more commonly perhaps picture description tasks where the learners have, you know, a few pictures and they need to write a story using those pictures. Or they need to do a translation task. Well, compare that to the L2 writing, which tends to want to give learners more ownership of their writing. They want the learner voice to come through in the writing. Well, the clear advantage of the picture description task, of the translation task, is that you're going to get more uniform writing samples from the participants, isn't it? So that's going to be an advantage when it comes to analysis. But that's not necessarily what learners do in the classroom. It's not necessarily what teachers are assigning them. Okay, when we look at the SLA research, we find that the errors in the corrective feedback tends to be very targeted, very specific. You might have encountered studies where the only error that was being focused on was, for example, articles. Whereas in an L2 writing context, we might expect to see a wide variety of errors being targeted because of the personal ownership that the learners are taking of their work. And so because each learner is producing their own writing with their own voice, they're producing a wider variety of errors, which then teachers need to deal with. Well, that can result in different learners receiving different corrections, different numbers of corrections. So it's a bit of a different approach. And these lead to various kinds of criticism. For one, in the SLA approach tends to be criticized for lacking ecological validity. And this means that what is happening in the study doesn't really resemble closely what would happen in a classroom. For example, and we can look at the task that I was talking about just before. We don't normally ask our learners to create uniform pieces of work for us. We don't normally spend extended periods of time focusing just on one or two types of errors. So that's one criticism for SLA, in that it doesn't really resemble the classroom situation. But on the other hand, the L2 writing approach is criticized for lacking rigor. You've got students writing all kinds of different pieces of work. They're creating and being marked on different types of errors. So where is the rigor in this kind of situation? So you can see that two studies which come from these different strands might be difficult to compare and could result in contrasting or inconsistent findings. Now let's consider the learners who tend to be the focus of corrective feedback studies. And we could, again, group them into two really broad categories. And again, they're not perfect categories, because what exactly is ESL? What exactly is EFL? Nonetheless, there are there's something there we can work with. So in an ESL context, these tend to be learners who, for example, might be in the US or the UK, perhaps they're studying in universities. An EFL learner might be, for example, on a required course. It doesn't have to be required, of course, but they could be on a required course at a university in their region. And again, that ESL context is going to be somewhere like the UK, like the US, I mean, traditionally speaking here. The EFL context is going to be something a bit more like, I would imagine, or you might imagine, Korea. The purpose, well, why are the learners studying? The participants in the studies that we're reading, why are they studying English? For the ESL group, they might be in foundation programs, trying to move into the main programs of study in the university. The EFL learners, on the other hand, or the learners in the EFL context, on the other hand, they might just want to pass the course. Of course, that doesn't, I don't mean that all EFL learners are only trying to pass the course, but you can imagine there could be some differences there. The surroundings, the ESL learners could be more easily immersed in the language. Of course, that's not necessarily the case. It is entirely possible that the learners will just group with their L1 groups and choose not to immerse themselves, but it's easier if they choose to do that. Whereas in the EFL context, and I've used the word must here, and I wish I hadn't done that, they might need to seek out those opportunities to immerse themselves in the language. Educational background. Well, the ESL learner, sorry, I keep saying that. The learners in the ESL context have perhaps been preparing to go abroad. They've had it in their minds that I'm going to go to the UK, I'm going to study at Swansea University or at UCL or wherever they're going to go. And so they've worked toward that specific goal. And that might not be the case for the EFL learner. I said it again, for the learners in the EFL context, who might have just been focusing on the content of their program of study. I'm going to introduce to you a series of studies that I've done, which seek to bridge that philosophical divide and to increase what is known about engagement with CF by those learners who might not have a particular interest in English. And when I say a particular interest, I don't mean, what's in their heart. I mean what we see by what they have chosen to study. So let's take a look. In bridging the philosophical divide, we're going to take from the L2 writing side of things in order to increase the ecological validity of the studies. So the studies feature L2 writing characteristics where the purpose is learning to write. Now, we're trying to develop the learners L2, but that's the grammatical accuracy is not the sole focus of the study. We are actually trying to help them learn to create academic paragraphs and express their ideas in structured English academic format. The context for this study occurs in a classroom where there is a process writing protocol. So the students produce a piece of writing, they receive feedback, they then are asked to create or to write a revision of that original work, and then they produce a new piece of writing. There are multiple, but limited grammatical features which are being targeted for correction. I'll explain what those are. And the tasks in the study are marked, which means that what the pieces of writing that the participants are creating are contributing toward their final marks. With the study or without the study, these participants would still have to be producing these pieces of writing. So these aspects contribute toward the ecological validity of the study, drawing from that L2 writing strand. To increase the rigor in the study, we can draw from the second language acquisition strand. So there is a control or a comparison group being used to help clarify treatment effects. And those effects are being statistically tested with groups that are of a large enough size to allow for statistical testing. It's a longitudinal, so it's not just a one-off study. And that grammatical accuracy is being measured in pieces of new writing. So it's one thing to give a learner feedback on their work and then see if they can reproduce that work with fewer errors, that same piece of writing, using the feedback that you've given. It's quite another thing to see if they can take the information that they've received on one kind of writing and apply it to a completely new type of, or a completely new piece of writing. So in this way, this introduces rigor. Now, a bit about the participants in the context. Now, because the three studies are set in the same context, I can describe some of the commonalities before we get started and reduce the need to be repetitive later on. So these participants were at a university in South Korea, and they were in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics programs of study, STEM programs. Tended to be between ages 18 to 22 and approximately 25% female, which was to be expected for the STEM programs in this region. Study 1 had 90 participants, Study 2 had 122, and Study 3 has 60. The proficiency of the learners was measured by the Oxford Online Placement Test, the OOPT, finding that there was a low B, or a B1 to low B2 proficiency. Now, the learners attended these required English academic writing courses twice a week for 75 minutes each, and the term lasted for 15 weeks. In all three of the studies, the groups were manually stratified. They were not randomly assigned to groups, because with only 122 participants, it's too easy for one group to receive, to become unbalanced, for the groups to become unbalanced. So instead, they were manually stratified to balance for gender, balance for L2 proficiency, balancing for knowledge of an additional language, balancing for experience time abroad, for example. Okay, so the data collected were writing samples that the students were asked to produce, and these were framed as writing tests for the classes. And the students tended to produce about 150 words, and they were given a choice of 4 topics that they could then take and develop as they wished. These were based on current events at the time. This is an example of a piece of student writing. And we can see that the student is beginning to master the basics of, the academic genre of English writing. We've got a topic sentence here. They introduce the first reason and offer some support. They introduce a second reason and then offer some support for that. Then they have a concluding sentence. Now, notice that there are some errors here, which are marked. We've deleted or indicated that the should be deleted here, added a verb here. Now notice this one, the nitrogen oxide. This was not marked as an error because learning articles is not something that you can do in a 15-week university term. And so we started with just a very specific number of rules that the learners could learn and apply. And this was not included in that list, and so it was not marked as an error on their work. Remember, the work was contributing toward their final marks, but the grammar was omitted from consideration for that. Okay, the writing samples were analyzed for the total for error ratios. So that means we took the total number of errors that a student produced, divided that by the total number of words that they wrote, multiplied it by 100. This meant that we, oops, sorry about that. This meant that we were able to sort of balance, or sort of neutralize the effects of some students who wrote more or some students who wrote less, for example. Oops, what was I doing here? There we go. So just to take a quick look at the targeted forms here. Forms taught in a class. Well, these were in the learner's textbook. These were what they were required to learn as part of the class. At, on, in for prepositions of time. Adverbs of frequency, always, do something, often. Most of, some of, none of. Using comparatives and superlatives. And again, those limited uses of definite and indefinite articles. Now, there were three other grammatical features that were included that were not instructed as, or not included in the instruction, but it could be confirmed that the learners had instruction on these because the Korean government organizes the English curriculum for all of the schools. So it could be said that the learners had been taught subject-verb agreement, the learners had been taught how to use plurals and select tenses, and yet needs analyses revealed that they really struggled to produce these consistently and accurately. So these three were included in the corrections, but not taught, and all 8 of these received correction. The first 5 also being taught. All right, so just to paint a picture of what the studies, the schedule that the studies tended to follow. In weeks 1 through 7, they had their normal lessons. They did the background survey, the Oxford Online Placement Test. And then in the middle of the term, this was framed as their first, big writing test. They took the pre-test and immediately in the following class received their feedback intervention, and that differs according to studies. So we'll explain those one by one. Immediately after the feedback, they did their revision. They received their mark, they went home. When they returned to the next class, they had their second writing test. And then immediately in the following class, the second feedback intervention. And again, they did the revisions, submitted their revisions, received their mark and went home. And then when they returned, then they had the third writing test. Following that, a few weeks of just lessons as normal, and then a delayed post-test there at the very end. All right, so study 1 looks at types of feedback. Now this article is currently under review, and the title is Teacher, What Means This Check Mark? And it was a quote from one of the students. I'll let you know where that comes from when we get there. Hopefully this will be published very soon. But the main question here is direct or indirect feedback. Which one is going to be better for this group? Now remember that we're seeing that the different types of feedback, when they're compared to each other, tend to be very similar. Theoretically, there's a lot of strength. There's a lot of evidence for using indirect feedback, right? We're engaging that cognitive mind there and helping the learner to engage more deeply with the feedback, which theoretically should produce better learning, right? Because they've had that cognitive engagement with the writing and with the feedback. So the learners were divided into 3 groups. One group received direct corrective feedback, another group received indirect corrective feedback. And for this, it was just a tick mark above the error. And there was a control group, and the control group received no feedback on grammar at all, just feedback on the content of their writing, on the ideas of their work. Revisions were required only as best practice. They weren't included in the study. and marks were not returned with feedback. I don't know how many of the attendees here today are teachers, but if you are or have been a teacher, you know that the first thing learners do when they receive their work is check the mark, and then maybe they fold it and put it in their bag, and that's the end. So there is some empirical support for providing feedback separately from the marks in order to encourage students to look at that a bit more closely. Now, I hope you will forgive me for this. I try to avoid these cheesy little pictures in my presentations, but I needed, that expression that a picture, tells a picture says 1,000 words, something like this. I need a picture for this. All right, so imagine this. The students have done their revisions. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. The students have received their feedback and it's time to start their revisions. So the direct corrective feedback group received their work and they look at it and they start their revision. The control group, they receive their feedback, again, just on ideas. And they look at it and they start the revision. What happened with the indirect corrective feedback group? It was utter chaos. For all of the years I had been teaching, I'd never seen anything quite like this. Students were standing up at their desks, waving their papers in the air. And this is where we get that quotation from, "Teacher, what means this check mark?" Now, before we got to this point, the students had been trained to use indirect corrective feedback. We'd walked through it together as a class. We'd practiced some examples. And yet, when they were left to their own devices to get on with it, they felt they did not have the tools. They had not been given everything they needed in order to complete their revisions, and panic was the result. So what works in theory doesn't always work in the classroom. Well, the teacher, it really wasn't ethical to continue that, right? We've got a lot of students really upset, really agitated, feeling that they're being asked to do something without the tools that they need to do that. And so how did we resolve that? The teacher walked around and gave an oral explanation about the errors to each of the students. Is that the best thing to do? In a classroom, yes. For research purposes, maybe not so great. But we can still look at what happened anyway, and we can see that from the pre-test to that immediate post-test, all of the learners improved. But we couldn't continue the study. We couldn't do it anymore. And so since the learners had been given one-to-one conference, like a one-to-one conference, right? The teacher went around and gave an oral explanation. Then it was thought, okay, for the next iteration of feedback, we can't continue this. It upsets the learners too much. Instead, we'll give them these one-to-one conferences. Great. Except it does sort of change what the study was, doesn't it? So when we look at the results overall, and I'm going to jump ahead to the very end here, because the only thing we can do is look at it in an exploratory way because of the change of intervention there. But we can see that moving from direct corrective feedback to essentially conferences to the control group, all of those groups decreased in the number of errors that they were producing. And you can see the control group sort of decreased, but not by much in the control group. And we've got the experimental one, the direct corrective feedback group. To take a look at that, well, was it significant? Well, again, bit of a problem with the treatment there, but yes, it was significant. And the pairwise comparisons show that for the direct corrective feedback, there was a difference between the pre-test and the delayed post-test. So writing time 1 and writing time 4. So it took a couple of times of giving this type of feedback for any type of effect to be seen, of statistically significant effect. For experimental group 2, the difference between the pre-test and the post-test was significant, and then it continued to be durable at the end of the study. So even though there was a lot of angst, a lot of anxiety, a lot of, teacher, what means this? They were still able to learn from that once they were given the tools to put that emotional impact aside, take in the conference, essentially, it was a conference, and move on. Control group, there was no significant effect. So what we see here is support for what has already been found, that compared to a control group, the treatment groups are quite similar. And yet we also see that what works in theory might not apply easily into the classroom. And we'll come back to that point a bit later. But first, I'd like to move on to the second study. So in that first study, it was discovered that when we offer conferences, the students were able to learn quite quickly, and that effect was durable, despite the poor students' anxiety that they experienced. It didn't hold them back. And so I thought, well, maybe we, as teachers, we can engage the learners with the feedback. We can help them engage in languaging to produce meta-linguistic reflections. Now, for anyone who's new to these terms, languaging is the act of explaining the ideas to yourself. So, for example, a learner might look at a noun where the teacher has added an S, and the explanation of that, they might say, here I mean many of these, and so I need S to make this plural. That's an example of languaging. The product of that languaging is a meta-linguistic reflection. So languaging is the act of explaining, meta-linguistic reflection is the product of the explaining. Is there empirical evidence for languaging? Well, the answer is yes. So there's evidence for oral and written languaging, but it tends to be a bit limited because the studies tend to be a bit smaller. For example, we have 22 participants in Storch 2008, 9 in Swain et al., 2 in Nosy et al. So this means that the effectiveness of these, it can't really be statistically tested. They also tend to use really highly controlled tasks. Remember going back to that, the SLA approach where, we're trying to create a highly controlled design, which is great, it's valuable, but it doesn't necessarily show what would happen in a real classroom, which is also something research needs to consider. Now, it has been shown that languaging is useful for lower proficient and less experienced learners. So it makes sense that it would be suitable for this group then. So maybe this is an alternative way of, getting that cognitive engagement going, but in a supported way, rather than expecting the learner just to freely work it out themselves. All right, so then for this study, I compared languaging on reflective worksheets to languaging in conferences. The reason for that, again, goes back to that ecological validity. The truth is that teachers might not always have that time available to say, yes, I'll give one-to-one conferences to all of my students. We might all wish we could, but it's not always possible. So then it was relevant to consider whether there was a way of scaffolding the learner's engagement with languaging or with their corrective feedback through languaging on reflective worksheets. So that's what this study focused on. Now, the worksheets looked something like this. We've got the problem being highlighted over here, which was on the learner's work. They just needed to log it on the worksheet. They needed to log the correction on the worksheet, which again was on their original work marked by the teacher. Then they needed to come up with an explanation. They could do this in L1, or they could do it in L2. They could mix L1 and L2, whatever they wanted to do. That was up to them. The conferences tried to elicit these meta-linguistic reflections and engage the learners in languaging in a two-step process. Step number 1 was, for example, okay, here line 3, do you see a problem there? And if the learner was not able to identify it, then the teacher would say, right here, apple. There's something missing. We need an S on the end of that. So now the learner has the problem and the learner has the correction. So the next step is to elicit some kind of evidence of understanding. Do you know why we need to put the S on the end of this word, for example? Again, if the student could do that, great. If not, the teacher would provide an explanation. Now, the point of this was to keep it short and snappy and keep the conferences moving along. Okay, so let's take a look at let's just kind of summarize what's going on. For the feedback, the the worksheet group received direct corrective feedback, and they were given 4 to 5 minutes on the day they received their feedback just to look at it. Don't write anything, don't talk to your friends, just absorb your feedback, think about it. Then they began the worksheet and then they began their revisions. Again, we were not measuring the revisions, just considering their, best practice. Sorry, got distracted checking the time there. The comparison group received direct correct. Yes, this is a comparison group. Sorry, it took me a second. The comparison group received direct corrective feedback. And I can already imagine some people going, that's not a control group. Yes, you're absolutely right. It's not a control group. The reason it wasn't a control group is because the teachers who were implementing this study in their classrooms were doing me a favor, and they were really not comfortable withholding feedback from their students because feedback has been shown to be useful, and they felt that that was unethical. Fully understood. So what this study does is it compares languaging and facilitating learners' engagement with that feedback to what we might call standard treatment, just writing it on their paper and giving it to them. Now the worksheet that they received was just, an opinion piece. What did you think of this topic? What was easy? What was difficult? And then they began their revisions using the feedback that they'd been given. The conferencing group also had a 4 to 5 minute period there. And sorry, I've just got something on my screen here. I need to move out of the way. There we go. They had a 4 to 5 minute conference. So you can see what I've tried to do is control for time on task. After that conference, they immediately began their revisions. Well, the relevant questions are, was it effective? Was it significant? And the answer, well, we can guesstimate, looking at this, the number of errors seem to be decreasing. That seems like a positive thing. But no, a mixed ANOVA shows that all of the groups, including the comparison group, performed similarly from pre-test to post-test. So that was not significant. But these individual t-tests do show that each group did improve and that each group improved in a durable way. So it was still effective. They maintained that accuracy, that increased accuracy at the end of the study. Now, some people are already panicking and saying, you've used multiple statistical tests to analyze the data. No. Remember, we used a mixed ANOVA for that. This was only to see what happened individually. All right, so possible reasons for that. Why is it not more effective to engage learners in the process of analyzing their errors? What is going on there? It makes logical sense, but something was keeping that from happening because even the direct corrective feedback group, they weren't even encouraged to really deal with their errors in any way. They weren't facilitated in using them, encouraged to think about them deeply. One possible reason could be just a lack of time pressure. Possibly, maybe it's enough. We teach them, we give them feedback, and we ask them to write it again, just as a matter of best practice. Maybe that's enough, maybe. possibly facilitating their feedback, isn't adding any additional benefit. But I think that we should take another look. So moving on to study 3, this moves into this idea of feedback literacy, which sort of came from, academic literacy, this idea that there's a complex set of social practices that are powerfully shaped by wider social and cultural forces. Now, I think that's powerful. I'm going to keep that in mind as I continue through here. But the definition of feedback literacy is an understanding of what feedback is, how it can be managed effectively, capacities and dispositions to make productive use of feedback, and appreciation of the roles of teachers and themselves being the learners, in these processes. So let's consider this. Actually, let's consider this with a chart because it's going to be a bit clearer. So this idea is we've got appreciating feedback, making judgments, and managing, affect, managing emotions, contributing to what happens when the learner takes action. If we examine these a bit more closely, we'll see that going to Carless and Bode's 2018 study here, appreciating feedback, and they give some examples, understanding what feedback is, understanding the role of feedback, but also storing feedback and knowing how to go and find it when you need it. Okay, making judgments. So making judgments about my own work as a learner, making judgments about my peers' work, but also actively participating in the feedback process, which doesn't necessarily match exactly what's being used in this category. Managing affect, managing one's emotions, and developing habits. Again, these aren't quite matching the categories they're assigned to. We might say that active participation in feedback should be part of taking action, as should storing and accessing feedback should be part of taking action. So this is an initial framework for understanding how students develop feedback literacy. Oops, sorry. Now, just recently, the study is in press right now. Chong has decided to expand on that idea a bit. So we've still got the essence of the ideas here. We've got managing affect, understanding feedback, that cognitive engagement there, taking action, making judgments. So these are interrelated in more clearly in this way than they were in the previous model that we just looked at. And now we've got the context and the learner. So now we're, considering where this study is taking place, where the learner's learning is taking place. And I love this inclusion right down here, experience, because this is so frequently overlooked in research. It's not included in so much of what we do. So let's take a look. Moving back to the studies, I had 80 conferences, right? About 40 participants, each receiving 2 conferences. And so, yeah, that gives us about 80 conferences to analyze. Of 728 total student responses, then that means the teacher says something and the student is expected in some way to respond to that. The IRF, initiation response framework, I think. Sorry, I've been doing this too long. I've stopped thinking about what the acronyms mean. 504 instances were of a very limited response, meaning the student said yes, no, add S, just very limited. And I've actually just recently reanalyzed this, and it's not 65 elaborate responses, it's actually 5 elaborate responses. And I forgot to update this before coming here. But there was, what I'm showing you here is there was very little back and forth. The conference presents the perfect opportunity. The teacher is there, the student has their own work in front of them to engage in a meaningful way with the teacher and get understanding about what is going on in their work. 159 instances where we just couldn't hear what they were saying, but the teacher's response suggested that they did. Now, this was interesting. Almost 300 instances where the students didn't respond at all, not orally, not in body language. So this was interesting. Let's take a look at what's going on. Let's take a look at 2 examples of a learner engaging with a tutor. And now I've got too many things on my screen here. I can't actually see, but I've seen it enough. At the top, we've got the teacher going, all right, you've got a problem here in, I think it was line 3. And the student says nothing. So the teacher starts to give a hint. All right, we're looking for an article, we're narrowing that field of focus. Start at the beginning of the sentence. Silence. So the teacher becomes really specific with that clue. Where is your noun? And here the student repeats, where is noun? Yeah, where? And it seems that the student points because the teacher says, yeah, that's right, safety standards, and waits for the student to do something with that. Silence. So we give a multiple choice question. Is it A or is it B? And the student is now able to draw on this. These were terms that were used in the teaching of the grammatical feature. When we were studying, is it general things or specific things? And the student says, so this is a specific thing. Yep, specific to the WHO. And the student then correctly identifies that they need the. This was the most common type of interaction, very common in this study. Now, there's only one of these, and it was so much fun to listen to. This student was so enthusiastic about what he was learning, engaging with limited language, but still we can see the teacher saying, all right, you got one more. The student takes another look and says, S? No. And you can hear that shock in his voice. And the teacher says, yeah, it's countable. He's really into this situation. The teacher explains, yep, pollution is uncountable, but pollutant, that one's countable. Wow. So the student seems really into this. The teacher continues, yeah, lots of different chemicals, they're all countable. Really, at this point, the teacher says, all right, we need to move on. So let's continue to the next one. Now, taking a look at this, we can see, oh dear, sorry, that's supposed to be highlighting silence. Things seem to have been moved around. Silence, silence. And minimal engagement is what we're seeing here. Compare that to what the worksheet group were doing. They were writing out full explanations. Now, I'm not trying to compare speech and writing. The speech, in the speech, we've got an interlocutor. We're expecting that interlocutor to work with us to create understanding. So it's not expected that they're going to create long expressions, but it's still interesting to see how complete and thorough they are when given time to write it out on their own. In order to better understand this and to understand what will be needed to develop the literacy for this group, I've got 2 more minutes. I think we're okay there. We've considered their proficiency. We've considered their knowledge of other languages because the groups are balanced for this, right? Let's look at the type of secondary education. Now, most of the students reported coming from science-based secondary schools. This means they were in technical science high schools, or they were on science tracks in regular high schools. So what does that mean? Well, here is an analysis of subject credits required by two types of secondary schools in Korea. One is a science high school, and you can see that a number of natural science classes, to make room for that, there's a decrease in social science and humanities, and that's going to include language classes. Here as well, really high numbers of social science and humanities, including languages, and yet not so much in the science and maths. So the mainstream high school students are coming into this class, if there were many of them, and there aren't very many at all, with one of these groups has much more language experience behind them. What does that mean? Well, the STEM majors, those in STEM programs, they may have taken fewer language arts classes as seen in that chart before. They may not agree that they even need strong writing skills to begin with. Now, this is interesting because as a teacher, it's my intuition to assume that the student is as excited about the topic as I am. And that's not always the case. Not only might they not be excited, they also might not even think it's necessary. And what we might call less effective language learning techniques can be used by this particular group. So there are differences in the backgrounds that these learners are bringing with them into our classrooms and into the study. Consider their experience writing L1 essays. Now, I'm not even talking about writing English essays, I'm talking about writing Korean essays. 59 of the participants, respondents to this survey, said they had never written an extended length, that's 3 pages, of Korean language essay. And if we include those who have just 1 to 3 of those essays in their lifetime experience, then you can see that most of these students are coming into the class with no or almost no writing in their own language. So if we're going to develop feedback literacy, we need to consider what they are bringing with them when they arrive. Consider their educational background more generally, because the ways we work in L1 impact on how we work in our L2. Well, what's going on in the Korean system? Gilito distributed 2 types of surveys, one asking about the importance of a given pedagogy. The other 50% of the respondents received a survey asking about the frequency with which they used a given pedagogy. And the finding came back that for promoting learner autonomy, it was considered amongst the highest of importance, and yet received one of the lower scores for frequency. Now, this must not be taken as a critique of the teachers. The teachers and the students are working within the system they have. And the fact is, these learners need to pass an all-important exam in order to get into university. Let's see what the participants reported about that experience. So this participant, when asked about his prior English experience, said, most of the English in middle school and high school was just reading and tests. And so I asked, was that preparing for that Sunan, that all-important university entrance exam? And he said, yep, don't even have chance to write essays and paragraphs because I'm busy preparing for this exam. Another participant asked the same question, said, it's enough just to solve the problems. I don't need to write essays to get a high score on this exam. And this exam is what's important. And participant 3 said, high school English is just about solving the problems, which I find really interesting here. Notice that mathematical approach to language here. So we can see that the students are coming into this class with what they haven't had the opportunity to develop feedback literacy. For the learners who had done some writing, I asked them what kind of writing they had done. Was it for tests or homework? And the participants said, well, that was just a test. And I asked, how did the teachers help you? How did they develop your writing? And this is one of my favorite quotes, is not help me, just teach. And through more explanation, that was, the teacher gave a score on the paper. And as we can see here, they didn't even receive feedback. They received a score, the teacher wrote some things on the board, and learners were expected to take that information and apply it to their own work. Now, maybe there's something, cognitively valuable there. That's not what we're looking at today. The point is, the students have not, even those who have writing experience, are not coming into this study, into this context, into this class with the tools needed for feedback literacy. So the conclusion today is that our current theories do not yet explain the degree of corrective feedback effectiveness. they explain some, but either we need to then limit that and say, this theory applies to this demographic, this proficiency, or we need to focus on developing these further so that they're able to explain more. The current empirical research since 2004 remains consistently inconsistent. And that's part of what makes feedback such a fascinating and frustrating area of research. A takeaway is that the participants in our studies are not blank slates. And I think that we need to focus more on eliciting what they're bringing with them so that that information can be used in the analysis of the results. Feedback literacy provides a promising framework for doing that, but it needs to be developed. So we need to obtain information on participants' background experiences, on their language learning experiences, and as we've seen, on their general education experiences. What have they done in their L1 that we can use and draw out and apply to L2? All right, I did run 5 minutes over there, apologies. But Jim, I think you've been keeping an eye on questions that are in the chat there. Shall I take a look at those? Are you going to pick and choose?
I will, yeah, because there's quite a lot in the chat. And I think, first of all, I just want to say, and based on a lot of the comments in the chat too, that we are all very appreciative of what you've managed to illustrate in this presentation. I mean, it's been so incredibly comprehensive, and it's so interesting to think about the interplay between theory and practice, and the connections between research and teaching. Yeah, we're getting more compliments pouring into the chat now. So,
oh,
yeah,
thank you. It's so nice to meet other people who are as passionate about this as I am.
Well, I think even for those who weren't before your talk, I think they probably are now. Yeah, I mean, yeah, lots and lots. I'll absolutely share the chat with you so that you could just see, because it's actually really nice to see these compliments coming in. So we do have a few questions that I will get into, and anyone else, if you haven't posted your question on the chat yet, please do feel free to do that now. But in the meantime, first, there's kind of this larger set of questions, and then I'll go back to an earlier question. So the bigger questions are around, it's actually really interesting, because the way that you talked about the importance of going back and getting this kind of linguistic background information about learners to think about how that informs what they're doing, is actually a direct complement of last week's seminar that Dina Mekmed Smith presented. Where
I'm sorry I missed that one.
Because she was talking about how important it is that we get our learners to give autobiographical narratives so that we know, right, what informs their current learning. So that was great. I also really appreciated how you showed the value of qualitative research in connection with the quantitative research that you were doing. So that was just kind of the first comment about that. But the questions center on Chong's three-dimensional conceptual framework of student feedback literacy, which looks really interesting. And I have private questions. I had a question. There was a public question, which is really good. The focus was on experience, which you highlighted. And yeah, so there was a question about why is this important? And Xiaoyan's question, which was, what is the definition of experience in that model?
Those are excellent questions. And I hope that the first one there, referring to why that's important, became clearer as we moved on and looked at how the learners in my study, how their experience had these large gaps in it that wouldn't have been caught in if the time hadn't been taken to investigate and ask them explicitly about their experiences. So yes, knowing what the learners know, knowing where they're coming from, can then inform what we do with them in the classroom. Now, about Chong's model, I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint everyone here because even Chong himself has said, I'm just throwing this idea out there and it's just a draft, and I hope we can all sort of start to develop it now. So it is an unfinished product, and I would encourage you to look at this. It's just a short study. I think the whole thing, including the references, is only 14 pages, where he just tries to break down those ideas a little bit more. Doesn't go into a lot of detail. I could look it up, but I'm going to be honest with you. Off the top of my head, I don't remember his exact definition. I should have included that, though. You're right.
No, I think it's good, because I think that's, what you have focused on is concerning experience in that model, I think is probably what is most significant in the discussion. So I think that, yeah, I don't know, that makes sense. And I think it was nice the way that leads into the value of knowing our learners' backgrounds. There are a couple more questions coming in, but I don't want to miss an earlier question from the kind of first part of your presentation. Yulene was asking about languaging, and she was saying, does languaging also include collaborative dialogue?
Ooh, yes, it does. So when you look at studies with oral languaging, they do look at how learners engage with each other when given a task, and they're given some feedback, and the learners look at that and say, well, what do you think we should do with that? Well, I think we should put in that. No, I don't think we need that there. And examining the quality of this interaction. Yeah, absolutely.
Good. Yeah, I ended up I went back to, I think it was Swain and Watanabe. Does that sound familiar? I think 2012 or something. But yeah, I ended up putting that reference in the chat because I thought that would be a good.
Well done.
So yeah, trying to recall these papers on the go.
Yeah, I can actually put up some of those, just if anyone's interested,
okay.
A select reference list there.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, that's excellent. There's actually a nice question here, which is, what findings surprised you most and why?
Oh, how much time do you have? This was a really fun study to do, and I was really surprised that direct corrective feedback, that group improved just as much as those who had been facilitated, whose engagement with feedback had been facilitated. I would have lost all of my money if I'd put money on it. It just didn't make sense. That if we spend the time going over and thinking through and engaging in languaging, that it has just as good effect if you just write the correction on the paper and give it to them. I did not expect that.
Yeah, I think this was the part I think that I found particularly enjoyable, was you illustrating these examples of the data that they were surprising to me. So I'm thinking, I don't know how anyone could have possibly anticipated those findings.
Did not it? I'm not going to. How many of the people here do you think that you're familiar with? How many students do we have here? MA students or PhD students?
I think the majority are probably MA students from multiple institutions.
In that case, let me tell you, because I think when you are a student, all you see are the finished products. You open up journals and it all looks so linear and so neat and so tidy. And no one tells you the tears that are involved when you get your results back and you find that there was no difference in your study. So I think that that's one thing that we can give our MA students and our early career researchers, that it's not neat and tidy. It just looks that way on paper.
Yeah, I think it's funny because, Jill, I do end up using you as an example of your research concerning the null hypothesis.
Oh, it's good to go down in history for something.
But we see, right, that as people have learned that these results are actually really important,
Yeah.
I think the dialogue is that's being generated from that's really useful. So I think you got in at a good time with that.
Agreed. But yes, it's exactly like you said. It's what discussion comes from that information. Why were these the same? The fact they came out the same is relevant and it's interesting.
It is. Yeah.
There's no reason in the world why that should be hidden from the field.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's good to have these discussions.
It is. Yeah. So students, do not be afraid.
Do not be afraid.
You could end up with anything. Okay, really good question here about what research can we do to identify the effectiveness of feedback in the future? And it's good because that's picking up on the comment that you had made about how theory does not yet support corrective feedback effectiveness. So how can we approach that?
Whew.
Sorry, big question.
Big question. I mean, we have to continue the research, right? And I think for those of us who are in the field of corrective feedback, we start to feel a bit tired by it. I don't get me wrong, I'm excited by my topic and I love talking about it. And yet there's still that moment where you receive an email saying, here's a review for you to do on corrective feedback. You think, really, another one? But that's because there's still so much we don't know. It is still so consistently inconsistent. So I think the most important thing we can do right now is to begin consistently, systematically gathering that data about the learners' backgrounds so that we are able to look at it and then use it in the interpretation of the analysis. Now, that was a bit tricky. If you go back and you read the 2019 study, you'll notice that the interview data, it's not a major part of the study. And I wasn't sure that the journal was going to accept that because I hadn't gone through and justified the framework I was using for the interview and the questions and how that was done. I just wanted to use it to inform the results. And I was very fortunate to find, I think, a journal who understood what I was trying to do. So as this becomes the norm, I think we can expect to see more of that. And then we'll have more information when we look at the studies and say, okay, all of these learners have this quality, all of these learners have this background. And now, maybe we can start to see some patterns there.
Yeah, no, that sounds really good. It's interesting talking about people on the topic of corrective feedback and how you keep getting asked by me and other journal editors to review submissions.
Did you understand I was sort of singling you out there? I've got 3 in my inbox right now.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, I should, for those of you out there interested, if you're a researcher in the area of corrective feedback and interested in reviewing for the journal system, please let me know.
Too funny.
Try to ease this up for Jill. Okay, I'll stop.
I'll get back to you soon.
Thank you, Jill. Okay, good question. This is a bit long, so here we go. Is languaging premised on the idea that there is a mistake? So the student knows what it should be, but forgot to do it in the performance of writing, rather than an error, meaning the student doesn't have the knowledge to know what the problem is. If so, does corrective feedback play a role in first helping students notice their issues so that they can go on and learn what needs to be done with indirect feedback?
You're right. That did get long. I'm going to scroll through and see if I can find it.
I mean, it is interesting because, of course, I'm also interested in that difference between mistake and error, because the way that we define that is important. And when we conflate the two, it can be problematic.
Thank you so much for saying that, because there are so many studies who give feedback without consideration of whether it's ever been taught in the first place. So then, are we using feedback as a tool for teaching, or are we using it as a tool for, increasing the knowledge of what's already been learned? And that's a huge difference. And that's another point that's been really underestimated, undervalued in the field, I think. So well done, MTS, picking up on that. Yeah,
absolutely. I think, and that was something that I had noted too. I mean, we were, between Catherine and Nathan and I, we were applauding you in the comments, because there was something really important there about that distinction, that you were making, to be able to provide that kind of feedback, and to note that it was significant, at least this was to me, that I was thinking about why do we spend time giving feedback on things that we didn't teach, and potentially even things that we cannot reliably teach ourselves? Why are we assessing them on that? So using it as a teaching point, I think it makes sense, but in any way to use it as an evaluation of a student's writing just seems unfair.
It just seems unfair.
Yeah, yeah. Now, of
Yeah.
course, unfair is a problematic term in academia anyway, but that's another
As
story.
is everything in academia. Let's define our terms.
Exactly. Okay, so another question from Ying Xiong. Will the findings be different if the participants are kids or beginners of second language learning?
Oof. I would, let's see, I see that question. If the participants are kids or beginners.
Yeah, versus,
I wouldn't expect a big difference with beginners, because these participants were also not very advanced in their production. Now they could talk to you about grammar, and they could, identify high level vocabulary, because they needed to do that for their university entrance exam, but their production was quite low. So I wouldn't expect a big difference with beginners. Kids, that's trickier. And it depends on what age we're referring to as well. I wouldn't be giving written feedback on young children's work anyway. I would be engaging them with ideas and, doing role plays based on the writing and being more creative about it, because accuracy at the age of 7 just isn't really that important. They've got, years to develop that. Well, don't we all, to be honest?
I like that. I think it is important to note that, the kind of feedback that we're going to give to young learners of English versus, of any language, versus other types of learners.
I've not done a lot of research on or with young learners. I have taught them. They are fantastic, but I didn't do writing with them. They were just too young for that. Yeah.
No, I think that's important. And I like that you mentioned, more creative approaches to feedback, but, and I think things like role playing sound really good. I'm skipping over Nathan's shout out to my book, but it is, I did think of that, Nathan, when Jill was talking about, the surprises and findings. But there is a book out there, a collection of chapters that deal with the kinds of surprises that we deal with in research. So
I'll contribute to the second edition.
Thank you, Jill. I was going to say, we need you. Good. Sophie has a question. When do you think we should introduce corrective feedback to children? So based on that topic we were just discussing.
Wow, that's so interesting. I'm all right. I'm going to start with a disclaimer. I don't have much experience teaching children, and I particularly have no experience researching children's literacy development. But I think it depends on why they're learning English to begin with and in the context. When I think back to the Korean context, the learners, the young students who are writing, accuracy is not going to be as important for them as the act of producing itself. So when would I start? When they begin to need it. I suppose once they get to middle school and they start focusing on that all-important university exam, maybe that's a good time to, introduce it little by little. But any earlier, and I think we risk detracting the students from the point of language, which is to communicate, and you can do that very well with or without accuracy. So I've sort of dodged that one.
No, that's okay. I think it is difficult. I think we probably would want to refer to, those who research young learners, because I think you're right. It's hard to say. I'm sure there are important theories around why and when we would provide feedback in various forms at different ages. But I'm afraid I don't know either. Not my age group.
Not my age group. They're cute. They're fabulous. I don't know a lot about them.
Exactly. I think nearly at the end of questions. So please do let me know if you have any other questions. Otherwise, we do have quite a lot of nice comments in here, and lots of support. And I really just want to say that I'm grateful that Catherine Walter is here today. So for
I'm
those,
honored.
those of you who didn't know, so Catherine supervised Jill's DPhil at the University of Oxford, and Catherine was also the one who created the Masters in Teaching English Language in university settings. So we are glad to have Catherine here.
Forever
right.
indebted.
Absolutely.
And grateful.
And grateful, that's right. There have actually been quite a few questions about recordings of the presentation and presentation slides. So the idea is that this recording will be on YouTube, and you can link to that through our center channel. Catherine says it's been my honor. And as for presentation slides, I don't know, Dr. Boggs, are you able to share slides or maybe an edited version of slides?
Possibly. I hadn't even been up to date with the recording that was happening, so it's all a bit new to me at the moment.
It may be on YouTube. We have to get approval first.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
Yeah, no problem.
We can work out the details later.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll confirm those things after the talk. But yeah, one last question from Zahid. How do you think your research on corrective feedback is going to inform your own teaching practice? It's a nice question.
That's really interesting because right now because I'm teaching in applied linguistics rather than teaching language, my focus is not on developing learners' accuracy. So I think that my research on CF is impacting on the teaching practice of the teachers who are taking the MA class that I'm teaching. It's an indirect sort of impact. Certainly, if I were to go back to teaching, I would be applying the principles here and finding out where the students had come from, what their experience was before introducing any new pedagogies and expecting great results from those.
I like that response. I think it is important that we have that kind of, that qualitatively we know our learners and we know where they're coming from, because I think that is ultimately going to inform our teaching practices, whatever level we're dealing with.
And I was just going to say that does apply to who we're teaching now, doesn't it? Definitely. Who are our MA students? What experience are they bringing with them when they come to our programs?
Yeah, we need to know that. So if you are a student here and your tutors,
if you're feeling overlooked,
introduce yourselves to your tutors. Make sure they know who you are. I think that looks like that's it in the chat for questions. So what I'm going to do is say thank you very much to Dr. Jill Boggs for a wonderful presentation. I don't know if I've seen quite so many compliments in filling the chat rather than questions, which is really, really nice to see.
I'm really touched. Thank you so much for the kind words. Been a great group. I'll come back next week.
Absolutely, yeah, and quite a big group too. So it was nice to see such an impressive turnout from so many different places. So for those of you who are still with us, just a quick announcement that the next seminar is scheduled for the 16th of December. This is Professor Constant Lung, who'll be talking about the nature of academic English. So we do have quite a bit around language education in our applied linguistics series. But for those of you who are interested to know, we do take a slight shift away from language education in applied linguistics research with intersectionality. And that is with Professor David Block, who will be presenting on the 27th of January. So those are the upcoming seminars. So please do stay tuned. There will be more information available on our center WordPress website, as well as links to abstracts and other resources. So thank you. Anything else, Jill?
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for the comments. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for attending.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Have a nice night if you're on the other side of the globe, or enjoy the rest of your Wednesday wherever else you are. And that will be my farewell. Bye.
Thanks, Jim. Bye, everyone.
Bye.